Can you talk a little about your career in the front office on the basketball side?
I Donnie Walsh, who's president of the Indiana Pacers, and I got to know each other when I was on the other side as an agent. And at some point, he came to me and asked me if I'd be interested in switching sides, which back in the early '90s was not something that was done. It was something that I always had an interest in, and so we continued the conversation for a few years, and then when I had the opportunity to, I had to divest myself from my business, but when I was able to do that, and the timing was right in Indiana, I went to work for Donnie. You know, he's in my mind a Hall of Famer in the business. Wouldn't be here today without him. He taught me everything about running an NBA franchise. And so I got to do that for 14 years. Actually, at some point, Larry Bird came back to the franchise, and I had the opportunity to work with Larry for a long time. And Donnie and Larry and I worked together, and then Donnie went to the Knicks, and Larry and I worked together. I learned, I mean, Larry's obviously a legend. I, you know, I between the two of them, I realized when I started work with them, I didn't know anything about basketball, and I had a lot to learn. And although I thought I did, but and the two of them taught me an amazing amount. They're both, just you know, brilliant. Um, Larry taught me a tremendous amount. Mel Daniels, who was a scout for us, taught me an unbelievable amount. Al Menendez. So there's a lot of people in Indiana that I owe a lot to. But I was there 14 years, and I think it was 14 years, and then went to Milwaukee, worked with John Hammond uh, and Senator Cole, and um, we were fortunate enough to draft Giannis and train for Chris Middleton, and at some point Senator Cole sold the team a year into when I came up there, and I after a couple of years, I left there and went to Utah and spent the rest of my career in Utah with Mrs. Miller on the team, but with Dennis Lindsay, and our coach was Quinn Snyder. I worked with Justin Zanuck at the time too, and we had a great run. We drafted Donovan, and had a great group of people in Utah as well, and loved my experience there. Actually, all three places, I wouldn't change a thing. It was work for small markets, great people. In Indiana, had an unbelievable owner in Herb Simon. Um, it was, I can't thank him enough either. So anyway, that was over, 25, 27 years in the league or something like that, and 10 years in agent. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what do you feel like your biggest learning curve was coming from being an agent to transitioning to a front office role?
Yeah. Um, well, number one was really understanding the game. I thought I did, but I really didn't at the level you need to understand it when you're uh, on the team side. Today, it's a little different because there's so much on the internet. When I came into the league, the internet was brand new. There just wasn't the social media world wasn't there. ESPN what isn't what ESPN is today, and so it was a completely different world. There's the access to information today is far greater than it was then, but I had a big learning curve in really truly understanding the game. Number one, then I think two, understanding all of the different dynamics that a front office, a president, or a general manager is dealing with. There's so many stakeholders that you're dealing with, from your owner to your coach to players to their agents to the family. So really understanding all those dynamics, and then learning how to be a leader. The position is really a leadership position. Um, I've always said I could always hire great scouts if that wasn't a strength of mine. For example, if it wasn't, I mean, I learned how to be a good scout over the years, but I could always hire great scouts. I could hire great analytics people. Um, I could hire great sports performance people, but the position as a leader, you can't hire that. You've got to be a great leader. And that means giving others the opportunity to grow in your organization and the ability to communicate well to not only to within your franchise, but to your fan base and to the community to make sure they understand exactly what your franchise is all about and the culture of your franchise. And then you got to live it every single day. So I think those are all things that I had to learn when I came came to Indiana.
Yeah. When you felt like things were going right in all your stops, in whatever moment that can be, whether that's drafting the right player or winning games or whatever you feel like the outcome is that you're striving for, what do you think went into that versus when you felt like things weren't going right? Do you feel like there was any correlation?
Yeah, I do. I think that so much of it was people talk about culture, um, but culture is I always call it a living organism that changes every day. So I think when you're really, really successful, you're living whatever that culture is that you've instilled every single day. And there's buy-in. There's buy-in from everybody, from uh, the people that are taking care of your facility, to your sports performance people, to your players, to the coaches, to the even your agents. The agents understand exactly who you are and what you guys are all about, to the players you choose to bring into your franchise. I think when you have total alignment and communication, we've had great success. I was lucky to be part of great success. Um, I learned that from Donnie and I learned that from Larry. You've got, I also think people talk about winning, but there's certain things you have to live winning every day. And when you don't do that, I think whether it's your players or even the community sees that. And then there's a question about who you actually are as a franchise. So I, Donnie, Larry, I hope I was part of it. When I got to Milwaukee, John Hamm and I had a lot of long talks about this, and we drove and talked about winning all the time. And in Indiana, that's all. In Utah, that's all they knew. The Millers always won in Utah, but Dennis Lindsay and Quinn Snyder were two of the most competitive guys I've ever met, and all they were about was winning every single day. So when there were times that we struggled, which we luckily, fortunately, didn't have a lot of that. We probably weren't as well aligned as we needed to be between our coaching staff and our front office. We needed to do a better job of that. We needed to communicate better, and I think we always fixed that. But I think that was the critical issue.
How do you go about aligning people in the front office? I can see it. I mean, we've heard it a lot from coaches that we talk to on the coaching side, but when it comes to front office, how does that look? How did you manage to get your
With,
staff aligned?
with just the front office people,
Yeah, or is it? Do you see it as a holistic thing?
I see it as a holistic thing.
I'll talk about
Um, I wouldn't treat anybody in the front office different than I treat every coach or every sports performance person. So, um, I think it's all about communication, number one. And they need to know who you are as a leader, right? They need to understand exactly what you believe in. And then you've got to live that every day. Um, if you don't live it every day, believe me, forget the front office or the coaches. The players are the smartest. They see it right away. If you're talking one thing and doing something else, the players sniff it out right away. But I think it's number one, communication. It's number one, knowing exactly who you are. And by the way, sometimes you make mistakes as a leader and you own them. And if you do own those mistakes, I think you engender even more respect within your group. Um, Two, I think it's really important that you assign uh, roles within your organization really well so people know and understand exactly what your expectations of them are. And then you let them do their jobs and you hold them accountable. One of the things I used to always tell our guys is, hey, look, you can come in and ask me about, a project and I'll give you my ideas, but you can do it better than me. Come back with something better than anything I ever thought of. Right. And let's get everybody's ideas. When a group is much stronger than an individual when it comes to building out concepts and ideas and process and systems and culture. Who are we going to be? Right. I mean, it starts at the top, but I think everybody's got to buy into it and be part of it. And so I think we were able to do that with our front office. So, and then you hold people accountable. Hey, I would tell you for sure, if you talk to a lot of the guys who worked with me and for me, that at times I wasn't the easiest guy to work with because I am anal for sure. My expectations are incredibly high, right? I expect to be the best every day. I used to tell our guys all the time, hey, how did we get better today? And if we didn't get better today, we got worse because everybody else in the league is getting better. You have to build that mentality in. Every single day when you walk in that building, what are we accomplishing together? And I think that's another really important point. People need to know that what they're doing is important. So if they work hard and then you don't acknowledge that and listen to that or hear it, doesn't mean you got to agree with them, but hear them and it's got to be an important part of your decision-making process. If you don't do that, then you're going to lose your group. You're going to lose them. And so I think we were at times really effective at doing that in all three places. At times we weren't, and we had to get better. And as you mature in your role, I think you just naturally start to learn. You're always learning and you get better, right? And so, I was probably better in Milwaukee than I was in Indiana, and I was better in Utah than I was in probably Milwaukee, right? But I also had time to reflect on the things that I wanted to get better on, and I do think as a leader you need to do that. You need to constantly look back at yourself and reevaluate, and be willing to acknowledge when you make mistakes and get better. And we did that. That was the other thing I'll tell you. Last part of that is it's not only holding individuals accountable, it's holding us accountable as a group. So we were really big into, let's look at when we haven't had enough data, let's look back and see if we didn't make the right decision, why was it? Was the process not right? Did we ask the wrong questions? Did we do everything right and just the wrong decision? I think that's a really important part of what you need to do to be successful.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that stuck with me, Terrence. Sorry to jump in here, but David, one of the things that you said at Elfs's event that I thought was really strong is it's kind of stuck with me is you just have to constantly inspect what you expect, and you're not going to get it right every single time, but that constant process improvement and understanding, what you expect out of things and reliving that and reworking that and trying to get better is something that at least has always stuck with me since you said it. I thought it was really powerful in the moment, and it's something that regardless of the department that you're in or the thing that you're doing, like that's something that everybody can take home.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's everything is changing and evolving around us every day. So if we're not inspecting what we're doing and changing and making quick adjustments, we're going to fall behind, right? And the expectations that was one of the things. My expectations were exceedingly high. I used to tell the guys all the time, everybody, if you're here, I already know you're smart. Now, what are you going to do with those brains, right? What are you going to do to make us better, and way better than I could do?
I want to jump into, and excuse me, this is my naivete here. I know I'm jumping into deep water here, but is there a difference between player evaluations and scouting to you, or is it all the same thing?
Player evaluation and the scouting.
Yes, sir.
I guess it would depend on your definition, but in terms of what I would say, it's the same thing. Yeah.
Okay. Going from being an agent, going to the front office, was that also a learning curve, or did you feel like how did you grasp that right away? And in what ways did you see yourself get better or refine that along the way?
My player evaluation side.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We did a fairly good job when I was in the agent business. I had a partner, and we worked really hard to try to evaluate prospects that weren't as well known, that we thought could either play in the NBA or would succeed in Europe, because we were a young firm, and we did it. We were a startup, and we didn't bring a lot of capital to the table. And this was back in 1990, 1989 and 90. So we worked really hard to evaluate that specific group of player, and we got lucky. You make your luck, but we also got lucky on a number of guys. When I got to the NBA, it changed in that I was able to the detail of the scouting and to get into the minds of guys like Mel Daniels, Billy Knight, Al Menendez, guys that had lived in the business for their entire lives, careers, played and lived in it. I'll never forget the day that Mel Daniels sat me down and said, there's a difference between hands, defensive and offensive hands. I was like, what? And then he went on like a 20-minute explanation. And I realized then that, wow, there's just so much to learn to properly evaluate a player. And then on top of that, when I was an agent, I was trying to evaluate just a player that would play in the NBA. But when you get to a team, now the evaluation changes, because he has to play within your program and your system and your culture. And so it adds an entirely another layer to the evaluation. So I had to get a lot better when I got to the NBA, and I relied on guys like I said, Mel and Billy and Al, George Felton, Chuck Person when he was with us in Indiana, Dave Babcock, Billy McKinney in Milwaukee, and then in Utah we had a great group of scouts. Oh, no, I forgot in Indiana, Ryan Carr, who just became general manager of the Indiana Hoosiers, and I believe is going to be incredibly successful doing it.
We just talked to him on Monday. I'm pretty excited for the opportunity to work with him.
He's terrific, and he's very prepared for this, and he loves IU. He spent a lot of years preparing, so I'm really excited for him.
How, Tanner, not to jump in here and steal thunder here, but one of the things that I think the colleges struggle with right now is just the lack of time to actually evaluate these guys. Because, I mean, you just said it, like, there is a character part of the evaluation, there's a fit part of the evaluation, and that is entirely separate from, is this player good enough to play in this league? I'm curious, like, any advice that you have for anybody trying to tackle this task? I mean, it seems like a pretty big mountain to climb. What would you tell somebody who's trying to do it for the first time?
Yeah, I got to tell you guys, in some ways, I think the way the GM job is set up in college right now is a harder job than even in the NBA, simply because, simply because they, we're in the NBA, we're scouting all year long, right? And we have today big staffs, that are scouting, whether it's pro, college, international. In addition to that, it's limited to a certain number of players. In the pros, It's the guy. So what makes this so difficult for college GMs that they're not only recruiting their own players back to them every year, but they have to scout every other player in Division I, Division II, and IAI, and they then have to have all these decisions made within a very, very short time frame when the portal opens and closes. And there's no collective bargaining agreement. There's no clear understanding of what a player's worth is. Everybody's operating under their own rules. I don't think there's real clarity as to, from an agent to agent. There's so many different agents in the game today. And so, I think general managers are sitting there, just with very little information on whether or not this player, how do you evaluate a player as whether or not he's a $600,000 player or $1 million player or $1.5 million player. So I think it's really hard. I do, in talking to a number of the GMs that have taken these roles, I think that they have to have a very clear process. System and process is critical. The database is from the beginning is absolutely essential. So they gotta understand who their universe is, number one. Then they've got to clearly with their coach define exactly the system they're going to play and the type of players that they want, right? And that's both in terms of playing style, on court character, and then off court character, right? And then they've got to, limit they narrow that database down to that profile of players, and scout, and then it's still a big number, and then they got to get heavily into scouting those players and diving into the tape, and then I think a lot of it also is the intel, and talking in terms of how they are when you get players that today you can't expect them to be in your program more than 1 year. You can't expect it. You hope. You've got to make sure that they're the kind of guys that can fit seamlessly, quickly, that are team guys, that are leaders, that are guys that are have a high basketball IQ. I mean, there's a lot of things you got to evaluate. So you've got to, number one, have a very clear process. I think you got to have a team of guys that you trust, that are studying the tape and evaluating it. And you've got to have an analytics database that helps you. One of the things I've said to you, Austin, before is that we always talked about eyes, ears, and numbers. That's what we always talk about when we're building our team. So what did I see in the player? What did I hear about the player? And then what did the numbers tell us about the player? Right. And then when we sort of looked at it like a Venn diagram, and when there was that small section where they all fit, they all crossed each other, we knew that was the perfect player for us. But it's a challenge. It really is a challenge for guys coming into the league today, particularly if they have not had experience in the NBA. I think it's really, really difficult.
So that's fascinating. I remember you talking about that, and I kind of want to press on this, because oftentimes you don't get everything you ask for. You have options. You have you're getting something and giving something else up. If eyes, ears, and the analytics are what you're looking at, were there times that maybe you took a risk on one of those things and it burned you? Or are there times where you took a risk and you really thought it worked out? If you had to, I don't know, sort of give advice on, if you only had two of the three, what are you taking? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean,
or do you not? Or is it just you have to have all three and you've got to have that fit, or else you're taking a major risk?
If you could get all three in your whole roster, then that's terrific, right? It's hard, to your point. It's you're not going to get all three all the time.
Yeah.
So then that's when you get into a room and you sit down and you hash it out and talk it out, and you want to find out how passionate are your scouts about the player, right? Of what they're seeing and what they're hearing. how passionate is your coach about him fitting into your system? And then from an analytics standpoint, how when you're talking to your analysts, how passionate are they that the numbers are right or wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, you hope you can reach some kind of collective decision, right? And you got to ask a lot of questions. I used to, with the numbers, if the numbers didn't match up, the first question I would ask was why. Now, why to our scouts? Why aren't the numbers matching up what you're seeing? Let's talk about it, right? And vice versa. And then the last piece of the puzzle is the coach. He has to really look at what's most important to him, right? And because players are human beings, they're not going to be great at everything. I always chuckle when people say, "Oh, this guy's is this, and this, but he doesn't do this." Well, yeah, it's human. He's not a robot. He's going to be perfect at everything, right? So you have to understand that. And so what are most important at that particular time within your roster construction that that your coach needs? And you and your, and then if your coach is communicating clearly to your group, then usually you can come to a fairly unanimous decision on on a player and in terms of whether or not he's right for the program or not.
That makes a lot of sense. I think one of the questions that we get in talking to folks is within our front office suite is just the dynamic between taking a guy in the league versus taking a guy, a mid-major guy coming up to a high major, or a low major guy coming up to mid-major, or even a D2 player stepping in into a Division I, Power 5 school. You've obviously had some experience with this between the G League and international players. I guess just any thoughts or advice on that, or how did you evaluate maybe taking a player currently in the NBA versus pulling a guy from the G League or international, or how did you evaluate those two things? Or how did it translate, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, well, first of all, we made a ton of mistakes. We made a ton of evaluations that just didn't pan out. It happens to everybody, right?
Sure.
And then you go back and you look at it and you try to figure out exactly why, right? But I think that if you have the right process and the right system in place, then you're evaluating them all the same. Yep. Right. So, for example, a guy that's sitting on the bench, Division I, or not playing as much, maybe playing 8 to 10 minutes a night because it's playing at a big time school, versus a guy who's playing 34 minutes at a smaller Division I program, you should be able to evaluate them all the same way. What's important to you, right? As long as you have enough tape, to evaluate them. What's important to you in terms of your roster and roster construction, right? And so we used to, and then you have to project, and we used to talk about all the time with our scouts. We'd say how we are when they were doing their scouting reports, we wanted to know who a projection on who they were today, and then who they thought they would be in 3 years. Right. So it took that into account, right? Whether you were an international player, G League player, college player, or a guy in the league, there was a lot of young players in the league in the wrong situation, not because it could just simply be because they're a great team. You look at Oklahoma City, there's guys that might not get the opportunity at Oklahoma City simply because they are so deep. But yet if they went to a young team that was a developing team, could just blossom, right? Yeah. Your system and your process should not be any different, right? You just have, but it's got to be rigorous.
Yeah,
it's got to be rigorous, and if you evaluate them all the same way, then when you go back, you have you can, and you're trying to hold yourself accountable. You can take a look at it and try to figure out what you did right and what you did wrong.
Makes a ton of sense. So, and David, I know we're coming up on 45 minutes here, so I've got a couple more that I'll throw at you if you're open to it, and
I'm good.
and kind of go. You know, when it comes to the analytics, I think there's a lot of different ways people can carve this up and how they think about their players. I'd be curious from you, because you've seen it now in a variety of systems, be successful and have areas of improvement. Like, in your opinion, what were some key statistics or some key analytics that you guys looked at that maybe translated across all of the places that you've been, or if you're open to sharing a little bit of secret sauce, like where some were really interesting versus not? Kind of share what you can.
Yeah. So you got to realize in 2002, we were just getting started, right? And no one knew anything about analytics. And I remember, I was looking on the internet and I saw a book by John Hollinger and I bought it, and nobody knew who John was then, right? He was, and I read the book and I was like, wow, this is really interesting. I didn't know what he was talking about, but, I was, and so the evolution over the last 25 years has been remarkable. And even since I've left the game, over the last 3 or 4 years and talking to a lot of guys in the league, there's been an evolution, right? I was never of the belief that like the one number player ratings, really, I struggled with them.
Sure.
I loved looking at all the numbers and the advanced analytics, and we've gotten so much better at the advanced analytics through Second Spectrum and Synergy, and diving into not only the offensive stats, but more of a defensive look, which we're still, teams are still trying to figure out. What makes basketball, difficult in terms of that analytics side, you've got 5 players playing together all the time.
Sure.
And, if one player, makes a mistake, it impacts and breaks down the whole offense or the defense, right? So it's always difficult, but we're getting better. Even though it's difficult, we're getting much, much better at singling out a player, and offensively and now defensively, his impact on a team. One player he's always had an issue with because they weren't customized, right? And so I always thought, well, I mean, it just depends on how you built the metric. I used to always argue about this with our analytics guys. Today, you're customizing it. Yeah, you guys are customizing all that. And teams, I think what's so critical is for teams to be able to define who they are. And they might change that year to year, right? So or every 2-3 years. What Rick Carlisle did with Indiana and what his system that he implemented over the last couple of years in Indiana is incredible. We weren't playing that kind of basketball and that kind of pace and transition and picking up full court. Rick recognized it. So you got to have players that can play that system, right? Well, Then you got to build your metrics and your analytics so that you're identifying those kind of players. And Indiana has done a great job at doing that, right? So other teams have now come along for the ride and said, wow, we really like that style of play. I think it's really a good style of play. And so I think they've got to adjust. Everything's an adjustment year to year, and so, where we saw teams going small for a while, they were adjusting their analytics for that. Well, teams realized that and they said, oh, well, we got to go, we want to play big lineups.
Yeah.
Right. And then all of a sudden they started adjusting their metrics, and customizing it and to see how that would impact the team, their team. So, it changed all the time for us. For me, it was always, and again, that, analytics, it's never, I'm not a math guy. So I would always ask our guys, do it in the analytics. I do an analytics analysis of a player using metrics that we believe in, that are we think are critical for the point guard position, and then give me a scouting opinion on it, like like what you're seeing, and then let me know if you're seeing differences in it. And then from there, because for me, I was always an avid reader, so I would read everything, and I would tell our guys, I want to be able to read your reports and feel the player. Close my eyes, and I know the player that you're telling me about. And then we'd go in a room, and whether we'd hammer it out. Dennis was terrific at that in Utah, where he's I've learned a tremendous amount, by the way, from Dennis and Quinn. And Dennis was an incredible scout. He still is. His ability to evaluate talent, but he asked so many critical questions and things, and so he would challenge our group and make them believe, and challenge our analytics group, right, to make sure those numbers made sense. And Quinn would do the same thing. So there's, I think it changed so much. I couldn't give you one number or how but just in a general sense, I think that it changes and evolves all the time if teams are really good at it, and it's predicated on how the style of play and how you want to play.
I think it makes sense, right? Like, your roster is pretty fluid, and if you think about the college game, extremely fluid year to year, or maybe even month to month, especially when you think about injuries. But being able to manipulate it yourself and understand the impact of that, I think, is really important. In the pro game, last one here, and then we can wrap up. But in the pro game, these guys have full-blown infrastructures, and they have analytics departments, and then they have front offices. Can you just maybe talk about the investments that these NBA franchises have put in, and compare that to what you're seeing in colleges for the coaching staffs? I know it's not comparable, but more so to maybe just give some of these coaches a little bit of sense of relief, because they're being asked to do a lot of things. When comparing it to the NBA, like, they have millions of dollars invested in these infrastructures, compared to college. That's, guys are scouting, recruiting, and going to practice all the same day.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't know how coaches are doing it. And because before we talk about the basketball side of it, dealing with the boosters, raising NIL money, getting out in the community, selling the program, and then they got to come back and build their team every year. And there is the investment that every coach has in trying to build the culture of this program, and then tie these kids together. If you have a player 4 or 5 years and you have a group of them, then you've got time. But when you're looking at it, you get them in June, and then all of a sudden in November they're playing games, and they've got to play together and commit to each other. And by the way, players have to assume roles just like they do in the league, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not really ready to do that. It's so difficult. And then you're getting to the basketball piece of it, and that's without talking about all the scouting. So I think it's, and by the way, that's before we even talk about paying the players. I've said this many times. I don't think the coaches should be involved in that piece of it. I really don't. How does a coach pay a player and then coach him? It's not. I just think it's very difficult on them. I mean, they need to, the general manager, now that general managers are, teams are hiring them, or universities are hiring them, they should be paying the players, and the coaches coach them. All right. If a player thinks he's worth, I don't know, I'm making $800,000, and the coach says, I'm going to pay you $300, and that's all I can pay you. I mean, it sets them up for the wrong start if the player decides to go play for him, right? Or the other way, vice versa. So I really, and I don't think they should be involved in those conversations with agents and even conversations with agents. There's some coaches in our league in the NBA that can do it, but I've always felt like, it's best to protect coaches from that because, look, an agent's going to tell the players what the coach is saying to them. They have a responsibility to their player. They don't have a responsibility to the program or the coach. And so I just think it's difficult for a coach to have conversations like that. They should be having them with the player directly, right? And so I think, I would just say that I think it's really hard on coaches right now. I think universities are starting to identify it. I understand it's a lot of money to invest, and so they're going to have to figure out how to take they're going to have a budget and figure out how to allocate the dollars where they can have some scouts and some recruiting coordinators and NIL people and whatever, the different roles. And in particular, I think there should be a role under the general manager who's responsible for going out for NIL dollars with corporations and so forth. The general manager, I don't think he has time for that.
Mhm.
Now he can come in and help sell it and close deals, but to go out and try to raise deals, I just think they're asking them to do too much, and they're setting them up for failure. And today, that's the issue with coaches. I've seen a lot of coaches in college where they're just grabbing players because they don't have enough time. And if they say no to a player, he's going to the next program. So for them to have a plan in place, and it's got to be in place well before portal opens, obviously. And to be able to stick to that plan, they have to have had a system and a process in place, and they have to drive that internally every day, to make sure that they're getting to where they want to be. So when they put it in place, they're ready to rock and roll.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense, and it's wild. It is actually pretty fascinating and wild to see the lack of structure that does exist for some of these programs. And I think they'll have to get there eventually, but
it's all new. It's a wild west. I mean, there's no collective bargaining. And look, I don't think it's the university's fault. I mean, it's just all changed. So they're trying to react and catch up. And, some universities have reacted a little quicker, than others. But it's everybody's trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, I'm hopeful that we can at least play our part in that. We're really, I think Tanner may have sent you over the article of, the custom models the teams are going to be able to build now, and we're excited about it. I think it's a piece to the puzzle, but to your point, you can't lean on one thing. It's got to be. I love the Venn diagram visual, of eyes, ears, and analytics, because I think
Actually, I have a question on that. Is there any players yet looking back that fit that Venn diagram for you?
Oh yeah, we had some players. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'd hate to single out players, but Paul George, when we drafted Paul, I think he fit into in that Venn diagram. Donovan Mitchell, fit that Venn diagram. But there were a lot of other, like, I'd have to go back and think about it, but like George Hill I think George Hill was a player that, when we were, we had interest in it in Indiana for a number of years. And we felt like what we were seeing and the numbers were saying would fit us really, really well. Dated West at the time, the way we were playing. He fit it. I mean, Jermaine O'Neal, I don't know if he fit the Venn diagram. It was so early. So I don't know if the analytics was a piece of that, but Jermaine and Al Harrington, that group really fit what we were trying to do.
Well, I'm curious also. I mean, he's the name, but like someone like Giannis, right? And he's got a cool, the story behind him is like a lot of people. The tape was a tape real? There's all these stories about it. So, like, what can you talk a little about that process and kind of maybe help shed light and like?
Giannis, and we didn't know as much about Giannis just because of the way it went. I mean, he came out of nowhere the last year, at the time, John Hammond and Jeff Weltman Jeff was the assistant GM during that season. They went to Europe and scouted him along with everybody else. But Jeff left and went to Toronto. When I joined the group and with Dave Babcock, Billy McKinney, John Horst, AD, we didn't have access to a lot of. He was playing Division III, so the tape was next to worthless. There weren't a lot of analytics. There were some things that went on where he was not made available to teams to interview. His medicals weren't available. So a lot of it was based on John Hammond's belief in what he saw and just projection. And at the time, Senator Cole, just give him a lot of credit because Giannis, first of all, nobody knew Giannis was going to be this. If anybody says they knew, they didn't know. I wish we could have said, but there were a lot of people who thought he could be a good player, right? The teams in the lottery, it was really difficult because they didn't have the information. So I think ownership groups were really hesitant to use a lottery pick. We were sitting at 15 and Senator Cole just stepped to the plate. And I was brand new to the process. I'd only been there a few months and John was talking to me about it. But Senator Cole stepped up. John was passionate about it. And the group was, they were. And so in Atlanta, there's all kinds of stories. Danny Ferry loved him and Atlanta would have drafted him. Atlanta had 16 and 17 right behind us. And so, we took a shot and what we didn't know, nobody could know was what was here and what was here. The competitiveness, the character on and off the court, the toughness, the desire, the grit. It's hard for me to explain Giannis because there's not many people that would have been who he was at that time and become with his body and his ability, become who he's become. But it's because of who he is as a human being. And his competitiveness, his desire. And when we got, we saw the talent when we got him in the gym. We were like, "Oh, whoa, he's got talent. Holy cow." He could really pass the ball. He could really handle it. We were like, we knew he was going to be a good player, but to be able to project that that the kind of commitment he was going to make to it, we didn't know. But quickly over time, he started to see it. And we realized, holy cow, this kid's got a chance to be like on a whole nother level. And what I love about him, I left there after the second year. And we stayed very close. My family got close to him. The way he's always treated the boys, he's special. Right. And we've seen that in his career.
It seems like it just looking from the outside. I'm curious, you hear players having a welcome to the league moment. Did you have one be in the front office?
Welcome to the front office. Well, when I first got there, I'll tell you guys, it was Reggie's seeds, Reggie and Mark Jackson and Rick Smits and Chris Mullen. And we went to the Eastern Conference Finals when we lost to Chicago in the 7th game. And in the last couple of minutes. And then the next year we went to it was lockout year, but we went to the Eastern Conference Finals and lost on the 4-point play in New York, to the Knicks. And then the next year we went to New York in the Eastern Conference Finals and won it and got to the finals. So I thought, well, this is pretty easy. This is great. Having said that, I never got back to the finals the rest of my career. Right? So what I learned early on was this is really, really hard. And Donnie worked his entire career to get that team to that level.
Yeah.
What was interesting, not a well-told story, but when we were flying back from losing to the Lakers in the 6th game, Donnie and I were sitting together, and he halfway through a flight said, "Hey, look, tomorrow morning we have all the player meetings, and then we got to talk because I think we're gonna need to break up the team." And which was that was a shocking, because we had, I haven't even named, the veterans from, Derek McKee, Sam Perkins, Travis Best. Jeff Foster was a rookie. Al Harrington was his 3rd year. We were such a good team and so loaded and so deep and so veteran that I thought, oh shoot, we're going to do this for another couple of years. But he had the foresight to see that it was going to be time to change it. So during that draft, we drafted Jeff Foster and Jonathan Bender and had Al Harrington, and then we traded for Jermaine O'Neal. So that was one of my aha moments where I was like, oh wow, this is, you got to really be looking ahead. You can't, you never can stay in the present, right? You can enjoy it for a minute, but if you're going to be successful in this career, you got to be looking into the future. And Donnie taught me that, one. And then two, I think, when we went through the Malice and the Palace and in Detroit, that I think rise to that team. I love that team. The guys on that team. Honestly, every one of them, obviously Al and Jermaine, but Ronnie and Steven Jackson. And, Reggie was on that team.
Yeah.
Jeff Foster, Jamal, Tinsley, they were all really competitive guys. We were a great team, and then that happened, and look, we take responsibility, and we weren't disciplined enough, and things happen, but I did learn a lot from that also, that when you roster construct a team, you have to make sure a lot about how each of your players will fit with each other, right? We grew from there, and so when we built the next program with Paul George and David West and George Hill, I think it reflected the fact that we learned some lessons from that experience.
Absolutely. Last question. Most proud moment looking back at your time in the league?
Oh, wow. Gosh, that's such a great question. I was really, I had left Indiana and met the team. We lost in the second round to Miami, but the next year went to the Eastern Conference Final with the Paul George team, and they went for the next 2 years. With that group, I was really proud of that group. I love the way they played. I love the way they handle themselves. David West was the soul of that group, and I have utmost respect for him. So I know I was really, really proud of that group. I had my respect for Reggie Miller and Mark and Rick and Derek. That it goes without saying. Chris Mullen. I mean, those guys taught me how you do things the right way as a player in this league. And Reggie did it every day. And Reggie's unbelievable, and the way he treated people and the way he worked every single day. So I was really proud to be a part of that, be a part of Donnie's staff. I was really proud when Milwaukee won the championship, not only because of Giannis, but my admiration for John Horst and Dave Dean and some of the guys in that front office. And I know the work that went into that. And Chris Middleton, there were a lot of players on that team that I had a tremendous amount of respect for. And I know the work that went into it. And so, I was really, really proud of that group. And then the last one I would tell you is we were in the bubble and we lost in 7 games to Denver in the bubble. And it was heartbreaking, just heartbreaking. Because Dennis and we really thought, Justin, we really thought that team would go, a chance to win it. But I was so proud of our group, the way they handled themselves through the bubble, the way they played, the way they all stepped up, and Mike Conley and his leadership, and Donovan, and that team was a special group. So every group at different times made me really proud, but it was more of what they did, not something that particularly that I was involved in, but more of what they did.
Well, you put them together, so you got to pat yourself on the back a little bit.
Well, I don't, Dennis put them together in Utah with Justin and my help, and Quinn put them together, and John Hammond.
Yeah.
And John Hammond deserves, a lot of accolades in Milwaukee, because Giannis wouldn't have been there and Milton wouldn't have been there. Chris wouldn't have been there. And in Indiana, I mean, that's, I hope I played a major role there, but, Larry's Larry, right? And, people don't realize how brilliant he is. I'll just say one thing, because he, I don't wouldn't talk, but he had a memory. It's remarkable to me. He could be watching a game from 15 years ago and tell you the next play that was going to happen in the game that he played in. I mean, it was, I used to sit there and think, how did he do that? And I could never, ever do that. So him, and then, Donnie, those guys are, obviously Larry's a Hall of Famer. I think Donnie's a Hall of Famer. So Mel Daniels, I think, is a Hall of Famer. So, and Herb Simon, Hall of Famer. I got lucky to be around a lot of guys that were Hall of Famers. So.
Well, David, we've kept you, man. I could sit here and ask you questions for I feel like I'm soaking this up. Most of our conversations are you helping me personally, but this has been cool.